The phone call came at 2 a.m. Garry Kasparov's voice was shaking as he whispered into Magnus Carlsen's ear. "They know I've been keeping records. 40 years of documentation about technological cheating in chess. My life is in danger. And if something happens to me, you're the only one I trust with the truth." The line went dead. When Magnus tried calling back, the number was disconnected. 3 hours later, news broke that Kasparov's Moscow apartment had been burglarized, with thieves specifically targeting his personal archives and computer files. But what the intruders didn't know was that Kasparov had been hiding the most explosive evidence in a location Magnus would never expect. And the secrets contained in those hidden documents would rewrite the entire history of competitive chess. Magnus sat in his hotel room staring at his phone, his hands trembling as he processed what had just happened. The greatest chess player in history had just reached out to him in desperation, claiming to have 4 decades of evidence about technological manipulation in chess. The timing couldn't be coincidental. Just days after Magnus had exposed Ding Liren's cheating scandal and Dr. Chen's revelations about cognitive enhancement technology, now Kasparov was claiming to have been documenting similar corruption since the 1980s. Magnus immediately tried calling the number back, but it went straight to a disconnected tone. He tried different international prefixes, thinking perhaps there had been a routing error, but nothing worked. The number seemed to have been completely deactivated within minutes of their conversation ending. This level of technical sophistication suggested that whoever was monitoring Kasparov had the capability to instantly shut down communications when necessary. Unable to sleep, Magnus turned on his laptop and began searching for any news about Kasparov. For the next 3 hours, he monitored news feeds, social media, and chess forums, looking for any indication that something had happened to the former world champion. At exactly 5:17 a.m., the first reports began appearing on various news websites. The headlines were consistent across multiple sources. Burglary at Garry Kasparov's Moscow residence, chess legends archives targeted. The details were disturbing. According to police reports, the intruders had bypassed Kasparov's sophisticated security system with professional precision, ignoring valuable artwork, jewelry, and electronics. Instead, they had focused exclusively on Kasparov's personal study, where they had systematically searched through filing cabinets, computer equipment, and document storage areas. What made the burglary particularly suspicious was the surgical precision with which it had been executed. The intruders had clearly known exactly what they were looking for and where to find it. They had accessed Kasparov's private computer servers, downloaded specific files, and removed particular documents while leaving other valuable items untouched. This wasn't a random break-in. It was a targeted intelligence operation. Magnus realized he was potentially the only person who knew the real reason behind the burglary. Kasparov's panicked phone call had revealed that he had been documenting technological cheating in chess for 40 years, and now someone was desperate enough to break into his home to steal that evidence. The implications were staggering. If Kasparov's documentation went back to the 1980s, it meant that the cognitive enhancement conspiracy Magnus had been investigating was far older and more established than anyone had realized. Magnus decided he had to find a way to contact Kasparov directly. He began reaching out through every channel he could think of, mutual friends in the chess world, tournament organizers who had worked with both of them, and even former Soviet chess officials who might still be in touch with Kasparov, but every inquiry was met with the same response. No one had heard from Kasparov since the burglary, and he wasn't responding to any attempts at communication. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Magnus received a text message from an unknown number containing only a chess position, a complex endgame that Magnus recognized from one of Kasparov's most famous matches against Karpov. Embedded in the position notation was a pattern that, when decoded, revealed coordinates to a location in Vienna. Magnus understood immediately that this was Kasparov's way of communicating without using direct language that could be intercepted. The former world champion was using their shared knowledge of chess history to send a coded message. The coordinates led to a small chess club in Vienna's historic district, a place that Magnus knew had been significant in Kasparov's early career. Without telling anyone about his destination, Magnus booked a flight to Vienna. As he traveled, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was walking into a trap. The sophisticated nature of the burglary, the immediate disconnection of Kasparov's phone, and the coded message all suggested that he was dealing with opponents who had extensive resources and advanced capabilities. The Café Central Schach Club in Vienna was exactly the kind of place Magnus had expected from Kasparov's coded message. a traditional chess club frequented by serious players, with enough ambient noise and activity to mask confidential conversations. Magnus arrived at the specified time and found Kasparov sitting at a corner table, looking significantly older and more haggard than Magnus had ever seen him. "Magnus," Kasparov whispered as Magnus approached. "Thank you for coming. I wasn't sure the message would reach you safely." Magnus sat down across from Kasparov, immediately noticing that the chess legend was carrying a worn leather briefcase that he kept close to his body at all times. "Garry, what's happening? Who broke into your apartment?" Kasparov looked around nervously before answering. "The same people who have been trying to suppress what I've been documenting for 4 decades. Magnus, what you discovered about Ding Liren and Dr. Chen's technology is just the latest chapter in a story that goes back to the height of the Cold War." Kasparov opened his briefcase and carefully withdrew a folder containing photocopied documents. "These are copies of the most important evidence I've been collecting since 1983. The originals were hidden in multiple locations specifically because I knew this day would eventually come." Magnus examined the documents, and what he saw made his hands shake. The folder contained correspondence between Soviet chess officials and what appeared to be military research facilities, discussing the development of cognitive enhancement protocols for use in international chess competitions. The letters were dated from the early 1980s and included detailed references to experimental technology being tested on selected chess players. "Garry, are you saying that the Soviet Union was developing this technology 40 years ago? Not just developing it. Magnus, they were using it." Kasparov's voice was barely audible. "I didn't realize it at the time. But looking back at the data I've collected over the years, it's clear that several of my matches against Karpov involved some form of technological manipulation." Kasparov showed Magnus a detailed analysis he had compiled of his championship matches from the 1980s. The data revealed subtle patterns that only became apparent when viewed through the lens of modern understanding about cognitive enhancement technology. Certain games showed impossible levels of analytical precision, decision-making patterns that didn't match either player's historical style, and timing anomalies that suggested external assistance. "The most disturbing part," Kasparov continued, "is that I don't think either Karpov or I were fully aware of what was happening. The technology was primitive compared to what Dr. Chen described, but it was sophisticated enough to subtly influence our thought processes without our conscious knowledge." Magnus studied the documents more carefully. Among the papers were technical specifications for devices that looked remarkably similar to the cognitive enhancement technology Dr. Chen had demonstrated, but with design elements that clearly dated them to the 1980s. The progression from these early prototypes to the advanced systems being used today painted a picture of decades of continuous development and refinement. "Who else knows about this?" Magnus asked. "That's the problem," Kasparov replied grimly. "Over the years, I've identified at least 12 other chess players who were likely subjects in these experiments. Some of them are still alive, but most have been too frightened to speak publicly about their experiences. A few tried to go public with their stories and were quickly discredited or silenced." Kasparov handed Magnus another document, a list of names that included some of the most respected chess players from the 1980s and 1990s. Next to each name were detailed notes about suspicious games, unusual performance patterns, and in some cases, direct testimony about strange experiences during major tournaments. "Magnus, the technology you exposed with Dr. Chen's help isn't new. It's the culmination of a research program that has been testing and refining cognitive manipulation techniques for over 40 years. And the people behind it have had decades to perfect not just the technology, but also the methods for keeping it secret." As Magnus absorbed this information, Kasparov revealed the most shocking aspect of his documentation. "I have evidence that this technology program wasn't limited to chess. The same research facilities that developed the cognitive enhancement devices were also working on applications for military intelligence, diplomatic negotiations, and political decision-making." Kasparov showed Magnus classified documents that had been leaked to him by former Soviet researchers who had grown disgusted with how their work was being used. The papers described experiments in strategic thought modification that had been tested not just on chess players, but on military officers, diplomats, and government officials. The chess world was chosen as a testing ground because it provided perfect conditions for experimenting with cognitive manipulation, Kasparov explained. Clear success metrics, extensive documentation of decision-making processes, and a controlled environment where the effects of the technology could be precisely measured. Magnus realized that the conspiracy he had been investigating was far more dangerous than he had imagined. If this technology had been used to influence political and military decisions for decades, it represented a threat to democratic institutions and international stability that extended far beyond competitive chess. Garry, why are you trusting me with this information? Why now? Kasparov's expression became even more serious. Because I believe you're the only person with sufficient credibility and courage to expose this conspiracy without being immediately dismissed or silenced. And because I have reason to believe that the technology network is planning to expand their operations significantly in the near future. Kasparov revealed that his documentation included intercepted communications, suggesting that the cognitive enhancement program was preparing to deploy their technology in major political contexts within the next few months. Elections, international summits, and military strategic planning sessions were all potential targets for manipulation using the advanced versions of the technology that Magnus had seen Dr. Chen demonstrate. The chess world was just the laboratory, Kasparov said. Now they're ready to use what they've learned to influence events that could affect millions of people. Magnus spent the next several hours reviewing Kasparov's extensive documentation. The evidence was overwhelming. 40 years of systematic cognitive manipulation, involving dozens of chess players, funded by multiple governments and shadowy international organizations, all leading up to the current moment when the technology had become sophisticated enough to be deployed on a global scale. But as Magnus studied the documents, he began to notice something that troubled him. Several of the names on Kasparov's list of suspected technology users were people Magnus knew personally, current chess players who were still active in the tournament circuit. More disturbing, some of these players had been involved in Magnus's recent investigations into FIDE corruption and Ding Liren's cheating scandal. Garry, some of these people on your list are still active players. They're people I've been working with in my investigations. Kasparov nodded grimly. That's what I was afraid of. Magnus, I think your investigation has been compromised from the beginning. Some of the people you trust may already be working for the technology network, either willingly or because they're being manipulated by the same cognitive enhancement devices they're helping to protect. This revelation forced Magnus to reconsider everything he thought he knew about his recent experiences. Had Dr. Chen really been a whistleblower? Or was she part of an elaborate deception designed to control the information Magnus was receiving? Were the other players who had supported his investigation genuine allies? Or were they being used to monitor and manipulate his activities? There's something else you need to know, Kasparov continued, pulling out a final document from his briefcase. I have evidence that one of the chess players closest to you has been reporting on your activities to the technology network for months. The document Kasparov showed Magnus contained surveillance reports that detailed Magnus's movements, conversations, and investigative activities with disturbing precision. The reports were written in a style that suggested they came from someone with intimate knowledge of Magnus's personal and professional life, someone Magnus trusted completely. I can't tell you who it is based on this evidence alone, Kasparov said, but I can tell you that this person has been feeding information to the network about your investigation into FIDE corruption, your contact with Dr. Chen, and your plans for exposing the Ding Liren scandal. Magnus felt a chill as he realized that his most private conversations and strategic decisions had been monitored by the very conspiracy he was trying to expose. The betrayal was personal and professional. Not only had his investigation been compromised, but someone he considered a friend had been working against him all along. There's a way to identify who's been reporting on you, Kasparov continued, but it will require you to do something that feels like a betrayal of your own principles. Kasparov explained that he had devised a test that would reveal which of Magnus's associates was working for the technology network. It involved sharing false information with different people and monitoring which pieces of misinformation made their way back to the conspiracy. But implementing this test would require Magnus to deliberately deceive people he cared about, potentially damaging relationships that were important to him. The person who's been reporting on you is someone you trust completely, Kasparov warned. Someone who has access to your private communications, your travel plans, and your strategic thinking about how to expose this conspiracy. When you discover who it is, it's going to hurt. As their meeting concluded, Kasparov handed Magnus a secure communication device and a detailed plan for how to safely share information going forward. From now on, we communicate only through encrypted channels, and we assume that all of your normal communication methods are being monitored. Kasparov also gave Magnus copies of his most important documentation, stored on encrypted drives that were designed to automatically destroy their contents if tampered with. If something happens to me, these drives contain everything I've learned about technological manipulation in chess over the past 40 years. But Magnus, be very careful who you trust with this information. As Magnus prepared to leave Vienna, Kasparov delivered one final warning that sent chills down his spine. There's something else I discovered in my research that I haven't told you yet. The technology network isn't just using cognitive enhancement devices to manipulate chess players. They're also using chess players to test and refine manipulation techniques that are being applied to other targets. Kasparov explained that several current and former chess players had been recruited to participate in consultation projects where they helped analyze decision-making patterns of political and business leaders. These chess players believed they were contributing to legitimate research, but they were actually helping the technology network develop more effective methods for manipulating high-value targets. Some of these chess consultants are people you know personally, Kasparov warned. People who might have access to information about your investigation. Be very careful about who you trust, because the betrayal might come from someone who doesn't even realize they're working for the enemy. Magnus left Vienna with his worldview fundamentally altered. The investigation that had begun with exposing FIDE corruption had led him into a conspiracy that spanned 4 decades and reached into the highest levels of international politics. Worse, he now knew that his own investigation had been compromised from the beginning, and that someone he trusted had been working against him. On the flight back to Oslo, Magnus began developing a plan to implement Kasparov's test for identifying the traitor in his inner circle. The test would involve sharing different pieces of false information with different people and monitoring which lies made their way back to the technology network. But as Magnus thought about the people he would have to deceive, he realized that implementing this plan would require him to become the kind of person he had always despised. Magnus's phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. "We know you met with Kasparov. Your investigation ends now, or the consequences will be severe." The message included a photograph that made Magnus's blood run cold. It showed him and Kasparov sitting together in the Vienna Chess Club, taken from an angle that suggested the photographer had been inside the building during their meeting. As Magnus's plane descended toward Oslo, he began planning his next moves. The test Kasparov had suggested would help him identify the traitor in his inner circle, but Magnus realized he needed to go further than that. He needed to turn the tables on the technology network by using their own tactics against them. But Magnus had one advantage that the network might not have anticipated. His investigation had connected him with other players who had been victimized by the conspiracy, Dr. Chen, Kasparov, and potentially others who were ready to fight back. By combining their knowledge and resources, they might be able to expose the full scope of the technology network before it could expand its operations beyond chess. As Magnus left the airport and headed home, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. The technology network had demonstrated that they could monitor his activities with sophisticated precision, and they had shown they were willing to use threats and violence to protect their operations. The revelation that someone close to him had been reporting to the technology network had changed everything. Magnus now knew that his next moves would have to be planned with the assumption that everything he said and did would be monitored by his enemies. But this knowledge also gave him an opportunity. If he could control the information that reached the network through their spy, he could manipulate their responses and potentially trap them. But as Magnus prepared for what would be the most dangerous phase of his investigation, he received one final message that made him question everything he thought he knew. The message came from Dr. Chen's encrypted communication system. "Magnus, we need to meet urgently. I've discovered something about Kasparov that changes everything. He's not who you think he is." Magnus stared at the message, realizing that the conspiracy might be even more complex than he had imagined. If Dr. Chen was right, then Kasparov's 40 years of documentation might be part of an elaborate deception designed to manipulate Magnus into exposing other people while protecting the real leaders of the technology network. As Magnus tried to decide whether to trust Dr. Chen's warning or Kasparov's evidence, he realized that he was trapped in a web of deception where every piece of information might be false. Every ally might be an enemy, and every decision could be his last. The only thing he knew for certain was that the truth about technological manipulation in chess was far more dangerous and far-reaching than anyone had ever imagined. The next phase of Magnus's investigation would require him to navigate between multiple sources of information, each claiming that the others were lying, while the technology network closed in around him, and somewhere in the shadows, Someone close to Magnus was preparing to make a move that would either save him or destroy him completely. But first, Magnus would have to figure out who among his trusted allies was actually his greatest enemy.